and then a lunch break. The working day today ends approximately at 15:30. Approximately at 15:30. After 15:30, there will be no events here. Like according, like the further things like the visit of Unbroken, etc. There will be announced later when they will have like more people in the room. So we don't need like to repeat it twice. But think about that. We have like until 4:30, like 3:30, the events here. And please don't like forget to communicate, to raise your questions, to ask it, and I'm sure we will have a great panel discussion today. Thank you, Andrei Kulikov, and
thank you very much. So we have a brilliant, distinguished panel today, and they are Dr. Peter Kreko from Political Capital, Nataliya Gumeniuk from the Public Interest Journalism Lab, Peter Pomerantsev, London School of Economics, and Nathan Hodge, the CNN. Take a look at the title of the discussion. David versus Goliath. Does democracy have tools to defeat totalitarianism? And mark the absence of the question mark after this, similarly a question. So one may say that there's no question at all if we don't mark it. However, if we remember that David in biblical records was preceded by Ehanan, and modern scholars seriously doubt if this was David who defeated Goliath, then there are quite a number of issues raised. What was the true name? Is it democracy that defeats totalitarianism? And why, as one of the distinguished panelists has remarked, around midnight, we have to use metaphors in such cases? So let's not speak in metaphors. Let's speak the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. We will accord up to 7 minutes to opening statements from our participants. Then probably, if they want, an exchange of opinions between them, and then we'll open the floor for questions from the audience. Before I invite the first speaker to take the mic, I would like to remind you that we often treat the Second World War and what has transpired of it as the victory of democracy over totalitarianism, while forgetting or silencing over the fact that the Allies had on their side one of the most totalitarian states in the world at that time. So that's another point of view. Do we have to mobilize the forces that run contrary to democracy to defeat totalitarianism? But this strengthens totalitarianism, which is on the side of the winners. So we are in a sort of a vicious circle. Maybe not. I'm waiting for the opening statements, and the first to speak would be Dr. Peter Kreko.
Thank you very much for the opening remarks, and I'm glad to be here. And yes, I think this title is like a Rorschach test that everyone can project their thoughts into that. You might be wondering what can a think tanker coming from Budapest can tell about what democratic tools exist to defeat totalitarianism, because Hungary have experienced this quite severe democratic backsliding, and it's rather an euphemism, in the last, let's say, 13 years. But when I was thinking about what to tell on this panel, I thought that it might be important to talk a bit on a media conference about the specificities of the Hungarian media system and what kind of impact it has on the public opinion, that we can we can measure in the public opinion polls. A bit of introduction about my think tank at the beginning. Political Capital is based in Budapest, but we are having European and transatlantic networks. We are doing a lot of projects on disinformation, on Russian malign influence, on Chinese influence, and also on research of the far right. All these topics have been quite fringe when we started to deal with them back to about 2009, but then they all went to the mainstream. We were the think tank that first invited the ambassador of Ukraine to a public panel after the war broke out. And also we recently invited Maria Mezentseva, MP from Ukraine, from the Verkhovna Rada, to Budapest. And her talk and her interviews were very popular. So I'm just saying that good voices from Ukraine are still very much welcome in the Hungarian public space, in a part of the Hungarian public space. Because the problem in the last, let's say, more than a decade was that the most centralized media system and propaganda machine have built up in Hungary that is working as an extremely efficient brainwashing machinery. And unfortunately, we have to abandon the illusions of the early 21st century, that after the experiences of the 20th century on, especially in Eastern Europe, on communist brainwashing, the societies of Central and Eastern Europe cannot be brainwashed. They unfortunately can if there is an infrastructure to build up. In Hungary currently there is a media system where more than 500 media outlets in a country of 10 million is in the hands of the government practically. We called it government-controlled media. And as a result of this highly efficient media machinery, the attitudes of the citizens can be shaped pretty much, and I think we increasingly arrive to the point when the public opinion in Hungary is not anymore the cause of any political decisions, but the consequence of political decisions and political propaganda. And let me tell you a bit about what our polls show, for example, on the attitudes of Hungarians about the war and the responsibilities. So what we could see right after the war broke out in Hungary is that the overwhelming majority of the Hungarian population, including the voters of Fidesz, the governing party, were blaming Russia for good reasons, for the invasion. And there was an election campaign that followed afterwards. So last April we had an election in Hungary where Viktor Orbán's Fidesz could gain a two-thirds majority, fourth time in a row. And the governmental campaign machinery immediately, almost immediately, not immediately, but almost immediately, started to push a so-called peace narrative. I don't have to introduce it to you. I think you know it well. And I assume, yeah, you heard it from all over Europe, but it's very dominant. It has been very dominant from the beginning in the Hungarian public discourse. And as a result of this media campaign, and also leading conspiracy theories that are echoing Russian disinformation in the mainstream media, the attitudes of the Fidesz voters, of the pro-governmental voters, have shifted considerably. Right now we arrive to the point where if we ask the voters of Fidesz, of the governing party, who is to blame for the invasion, it's first the United States, second Ukraine, and then comes Russia, which is, I think, outrageous, which I think is blasphemous. But at the same time, I want to underline that there is no such a thing in Hungarian public opinion as a deeply rooted, let's say, negative sentiment towards Ukraine, as a deeply rooted love towards Russia. This is something like a political product that in a highly centralized media system under Viktor Orbán's rule have built up, and it's working as a very efficient brainwashing machinery. But given the fact that it's only 50% of the active voters who supported Fidesz, of course it's a lot, and not everyone participates in the elections, it's about 1/3 of the Hungarian population. And if you take a deeper look at the polls, you can see that there is a quite strong pro-Ukrainian segment of the Hungarian society that feels sympathy towards Ukraine, that wants to support Ukraine, that does steps to support Ukraine, and I think it's still important. So I think when it comes to, Viktor Orbán tells it many times, he uses this metaphor of David versus Goliath to the fight between Brussels and Hungary, and Hungary's fight for national sovereignty. Hungary is the Goliath, Hungary is the David, and Brussels is the Goliath. For example, imposing sanctions on European states. On the other hand, if you want to challenge the pro-governmental, often pro-Russian, but definitely conspiratorial and relativist rhetoric, you find yourself in the position of being David against the Goliath, so fighting against a pro-governmental media behemoth. But still, even in an environment like that, I think there is a success that can be made. And I will just very briefly talk about a project that we have just launched early this year. It's called the Hungarian Hub Against Disinformation, Hungarian Digital Media Observatory. It's a project supported by the European Commission. And we have a fact-checking partner called Lakmus. Some of you probably heard about that. And their work, I think, is pretty encouraging. They could achieve that they had about 2 million visitors from Hungary only last year, only in a year, in a country of 10 million. And they are doing a lot of fact checks to debunk Russian disinformation, a lot of fact checks to debunk COVID-related disinformation. That war-related disinformation is pretty important, and many of their posts is becoming viral. I think even highlighting the fact that fact-checking is not necessarily has to be boring. Fact-checking does not necessarily has to be educational, does not have to be lecturing, and it can be even, I think, pretty powerful tool.
1 minute left.
Okay, 1 minute left. So it's one element. So we have a fact-checking partner. We have AFP, the French press agency, as a partner. We have Mérték Media Monitor, and we Political Capital is doing in-depth research of the attitudes of Hungarians and also of the media environment and the social media landscape, which is increasingly over-dominated by Fidesz against. So the social media can be dominated in the same way than the traditional media. And just one final thought about, again, to going along this softly optimistic line, we also did an experimental research recently where we tested one tool to help people to distinguish between fake news and real news. What we found is that if we use a method, and it was published in Nature Human Behavior, we found that if we use media literacy tools in a way to empower the people, saying that read this text and then you have to explain to your friend, to your grandmother, to your mother, how to fight against fake news. If you empower the people, if you give them tools and at the same time put them in the expert position, then it can be pretty efficient. So we found pretty high effect sizes in our intervention. I'm happy to talk a bit about that later, but I right now stop here.
Thank you very much for putting us into the context of the situation in Hungary. And as often happens, the final thought may become the starting thought or the starting idea for the next speaker. And if Nataliya Gumeniuk would like to say a couple of words about this empowerment of the audience, we'll be grateful.
as my whole talk would be a bit more about empowerment, so I probably won't start, but the interesting way how the metaphors works, because, you know, quite an interesting perspective, because for me, the David against Goliath is something I've been writing for the last year, first of all, and about the idea about democracy, defeating totalitarianism in details. There are a lot of talks about the, you know, we can also use the term underdog. I like this one more, to be honest. And internationally, and I think that's exactly why there is an interest to Ukraine. There is this chance in a lot of conflicts, in a lot of wars. People feel like powerless, that they can do nothing. Ukraine gives this idea that, you know, something is possible. And, you know, that's why there is solidarity, and that's why there is a chance to, you know, to win, because I think that the only way is not to call for help and demand solidarity, but really to inspire. And also, I think one of the reasons why, when we speak in different forums, and people from various other countries, you know, sometimes saying, you know, why there is so much interest to Ukraine, why Ukraine has that much international solidarity, I always say that it's not just because we turn to be a European country. The difference is that in Ukraine, at the moment when the Russia invaded Ukraine with a full-scale invasion, Ukraine practices 8 years of democracy. So they have a democratic society by this time, a democratic government, the parliament, the civil society, which is very coherent with its voice. And of course, I feel very sorry. I feel very, you know, and I'm very honest, you know, with my Syrian fellows, Belarus fellows, and the others. These things works because there is whole Ukrainian community and legit state and legit army which demands arms. If Ukraine hadn't been democracy at this moment and Russia invaded, nothing would work. So that, for me, the biggest argument why Ukraine has the solidarity and why it's working like that. It's also the whole, you know, Ukrainian society and civil society and the government who are asking for the policies to support Ukraine in Poland, in Hungary, in London, in DC. But for me, the most important is really to speak about Ukraine because what is, for me, for the Ukrainians, the most important, it's clearly, you know, Ukraine is David, but do we really understand who we are and because in order to David to win against Goliath, you need to understand your strengths and how to turn your weaknesses to your strengths. So for me, I was fascinating traveling around Ukraine for the last year and a half and looking at the things which we always considered some kind of our weaknesses, and they worked, in particular because it's democracy. So in Severodonetsk, you know, things might not work sometimes when it was still not occupied. But sometimes, you know, you have a stronger governor, but maybe a weaker mayor, but somebody stronger from the city council, but then the volunteer. And from all these 4 different people and entities, something works. And in every single regional place, there would be different groups of different governance. Mayor and you know, in Ukraine, the mayors are elected, the governors are appointed. But when they work together, and because they are representing different political forces, actually it's like the net which helps each other. And if one body doesn't work, the second will come. Because that's why I think the fact that Ukraine is not that hierarchical helped a lot Ukraine to, you know, be ready for the war and react very fast during the first, especially first half of the year. The same is about the generations. You know, we always can think about the new generation in Ukraine and old-fashioned Soviet, but why Ukrainian railway is so magnificent? Because there are these new young people coming with the management skills, but they really need a backup of the people who know how the trains run and how to organize things. And the fact that there is this communication between the generation and, you know, the old generation is brought back to run the things in order, you know, the country works. For me, it's still, you know, the part of the democratic culture of Ukraine. Of course, I'm speaking about the multiculturalness of Ukraine, which is, you know, which is always highlighted, but in practicality, that's what I meant, that in Zaporizhia, there would be the Armenian community helping. The Jewish community of Mariupol would be bringing the people from Mariupol, and in Dnipro, they will take care and work with the Christians. You know, if you think about the, you know, religious and the ethnics, and this is also the part of the democracy, and that Ukraine is this diverse. And this makes its strengths and the net. The fact that, we sometimes speak about the political differences, but for me it was so interesting to hear that the governor and the mayor of Kharkiv, which is very basic, needed to sit together and understand when they need to close the underground as a bomb shelter and take the decision when they can open it as a subway. And that was the question that, that would be the wise decision, because two people of different political forces come together and take this decision, which is stronger and better and would be more accepted by the people. So that would be my, idea about why, in practicality, we need to think about the democracy today as efficiency. I speak about the fellow soldiers, and, they would tell me, the civilians who came to the army, how they are teaching their commanders what is the military charter and saying, we should do this, we should do that. So in a way, the democratization of the army is also, the part why the army, in which a person was not forced, partially forced, but was not ordered, but took the decision to fight, is really more sustainable than the army, which lives without this democratic idea in it. That's why this army, for me, may be smaller. Unpredictability of the democracy is also the way, because exactly because it's unpredictable, it works, because the Goliath wouldn't really react properly on. They know how to react on something predictable. But if there are a lot of different decisions taken in the different centers, that's why when it's strong. And I shortly would add on things that the vagueness of Ukrainian political state, it's its strengths, that there are sometimes no one rule, but people are, especially in this war, we rely on the people take the decision on the ground level, the ones which fit their community. Because you cannot give one guideline to every single mayor of the village how to react. You really need to say that this person needs to take the decision on the local level. And that's, for me, makes it strong. If there would be one decision, it won't fit this area and not that area. And being on the Lviv Media Forum, my final thought about the media and why it's strong. For every journalist, especially foreign journalists, who ask me, whether Ukrainian journalists are critical to their government, and when there is any, investigation about corruption or so, I was saying, but look, democracy is not the place where things works. It's just, it's not happening anywhere. Democracy is the place when there are problems and they're fixed. It's not like there are no problems. There are problems everywhere. And problems can be fixed when they are talked. So for me, the only way is to talk about the problems and fix them and make it stronger in order to there. So I'm finalizing really with this idea that that democracy is just generally more efficient. And the Ukrainian war really, and the Ukrainian state during the war really proved that.
Thank you very much. And as in the case with Dr. Kreko and Nataliya Gumeniuk, I would like to I actually ask and implore Peter Pomerantsev to take up the final thought of Nataliya Gumeniuk and continue in your vein.
Sure. Thank you very much, Peter, Nataliya. I focus on this very diffuse and hard to define term, propaganda, and try to think about it in this context. I think what we're all wrestling with is how can democracies compete, or should they compete, with the totalitarian propaganda machine? We all know how Russia and increasingly China use propaganda. We've all studied it at least for sort of 8 years now. Many people in this room have written about it and raised awareness about it. We know how they use TV channels that push conspiracy theories, how they use troll farms to spread disinformation, how they use officials at the UN to push untruths and often dehumanizing narratives. But the question we also need to think about is, what is the democratic response? Do we just become like them? Do we just replicate what they do? I don't think that's A, possible for many reasons, and B, particularly advisable. But at the same time, the idea that the way we conceive of the relationship between information and democracy, between media and democracy, the way we conceive of it now might not be able to compete as well. So if we think that simply a marketplace of ideas, this very strange metaphor that is often used in relation to our understanding of the role of information and democracy, will simply solve the problem, it's highly unlikely. It's a metaphor that seems to imply that if you just get the truth out there about what's happening in Ukraine, about historical issues, it'll simply reach the Orban supporters in Hungary through some sort of theory of rational choice. That conceit seems to be not working very well. I live in America, where we see very clearly people selecting to live in alternative realities. So if simply that model of delivering information is not enough, the question then becomes, what do we need to do? And I do think that in this conflict, we're seeing interesting innovations which might open the door to starting to compete. I think my colleagues from the Reckoning Project have been on stage a lot the last 2 days, and maybe I'm sure they've explained a lot of our thinking. But with Nataliya, with Janine Di Giovanni and others, what we try to do is put law and journalism together. Again, that's not two professions that usually work together, but that is one way of thinking about how you move from information to justice, from truth to justice, not simply putting the information out and hoping that it works, but actually moving the truth about war crimes quickly to some sort of enforcement. And when we started, we had a lot of friendly pushback from friends of mine at the BBC and AP saying, how dare you as journalists work with lawyers? You should never share information with lawyers. This breaks every idea about what journalism is. Well, lawyers are our enemies. We should only give them information when they come with a warrant. But I think, and I understand that argument, but I think in this context, when we're working against this sort of enemy, lawyers and journalists can work together in the larger context of achieving justice. So that's one small innovation. There's other innovations happening. I see Ukrainian investigative journalists who are exposing the connections between Western companies and Russia, starting to work with advocates, starting to work with lawyers, so that they don't simply expose what's going on, but go to the next step of advocating that these companies are sanctioned. Again, that's a bit of a shift, from simply exposing and hoping that the information works to actually connecting information and action. And this idea of how do we reach audiences more actively. The other side is doing this all the time, If we take Russia as the example, we know perfectly well that they would use one message to target the far right in Europe, another one to target the far left, another one to target the business elites. They are masters of shifting their narrative according to their aim. Now, anybody who believes in a democratic public sphere, I don't think can be so cynical in their use of information. However, we do have to think about audiences and how we reach them in a much more active way. And I'll give one example of how we were thinking about this actually in Ukraine before the invasion. It's on a project that Nataliya and I worked on together. And we were looking at audiences that are susceptible to conspiratorial propaganda. The audiences in Ukraine that were susceptible to conspiratorial messages. But our methodology could be applied in other contexts. So we found that these audiences who were sort of listening to Medvedchuk propaganda about Sorosiata, about a secret government controlling Ukraine from the West, they were susceptible to these messages. But when we did a lot of social research, polling, qualitative research, we found that the roots of their susceptibility was deeply connected to a lack of a feeling of agency. Yeah? For various personal reasons, for historical reasons, they felt that they weren't in control of their lives. Their communities weren't in control of their fate. And so what we proposed was that actually the way to fix this is not to bombard them with, here is the truth, go and listen to it, you foolish people. But to actually...
1 minute, Peter.
Yeah, I know, I have my own little clock. I have agency.
It's just to show that I noticed this.
Okay, good. So what we proposed was don't just bombard them with the facts if they have this deep emotional barrier. You have to work with the sense of agency. So actually the solution might not really be in trying to prove or disprove arguments, but actually trying to think of journalistic innovations that help strengthen a sense of agency. So we were looking at movements like engagement journalism, which really treats journalism as a social service, where local communities are asked about what issues do you want covered, how do we make this information something that improves your lives, and so on and so forth. There's many ways forward about how to try this. But again, fundamentally changing the relationship between the audience and the media, from the media just broadcasting down to actually being a partner in strengthening the civic potential of people. So those are just some ways that we can start to compete in a democratic way with the Goliath of the totalitarian propaganda machine. I think my minute is up.
Thank you very much. The task of a moderator when he or she is dealing with such a distinguished panel is actually reminded of the time, not so much as steering the discussion. And that's why I, from time to time, have to justify my presence on this stage. Nathan Hodge, CNN, journalistic innovations. Does the CNN pay attention to this at all, or is it easier to work in the well-tested way for years and years and years?
Well, I'll start by describing what I do for CNN, and I'm what you call a row editor. And that's basically, in sort of traditional journalism speak, I'm responsible for making sure that our stories, our television packages, all meet editorial standards, and we're responsible for fact-checking, quality control at the content factory, which is not an easy job now in this world of what I'd call postmodern propaganda, a world that Peter and others have described so ably. And I come to the job from being based in Moscow first as a bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal, and then for CNN, and before that working in Afghanistan. And I was really struck by what Gulliver Kreko said yesterday when he talked about the sort of linguistic contortions that you had to go through when you were trying, let's say in 2014, 2015, to come up with the appropriate journalistic shorthand for describing, well, are they pro-Russian separatists? Are they Russian-backed separatists? Are they Russian proxies? When, in the sort of the traditional rules of the newsroom, one would always have to add some kind of boilerplate line. And I remember having arguments about this with our desk, which would be, do we have to add a line that says Russia maintains that it has no troops in Ukraine? In other words, do you want to amplify a lie? Because we had correspondents, we had our journalists on the ground in Ukraine from 2014 on, both with the Journal and with CNN. And it is, the interesting thing about news organizations, hopefully they are learning organizations, because there's been a very steep learning curve over, I'd say, the past 8 years, where I think, and I would hope, that newsrooms and journalists are coming to more of a realization, why do we call it, I would call it postmodern propaganda, disinformation, whatever the catchphrase of the day may be. Because this is not traditional totalitarian propaganda where we're all following fearless leader into the bright, shining future. No, it's a world of disorientation, confusion, and information noise. And it's also a world where, say for instance in Russia, the powers that be understand our rules of journalism. They understand the way we work, they understand our professional ethics, and they use that understanding as an opportunity to lie. They abuse, I would say, for instance, our rules of fair comment, our deep-rooted standards about, the right to reply, and they use that as an occasion to lie. How do you deal with that? Well, I would say sort of again, it's a learning curve. Over the past 8 years especially, and this isn't something that's exclusively from the experience of covering Russia's war on Ukraine, but it's been a large part of it. It's been part of covering American domestic politics as well, where I think newsrooms have become sort of inoculated somewhat to this kind of disinformation and confusion, where it's no longer adequate to say, well, we'll give someone, the opportunity to give us comments or give us a reply. When, for instance, our reporters were on the ground firsthand, seeing the atrocities in Bucha, the traditional journalistic instinct is to say, but Russia maintains, that these are crisis actors, this is staged, when it's clearly nonsense. And that was their response. Well, the appropriate response is not to say, but Russia says this. It's to not give that kind of reply, that either the time of day, don't give them a platform to lie, or if your journalistic ethic requires that you must give some kind of comment, then you have to, I would say, lard it with the appropriate context so that a reader actually understands, or a viewer, that number one, we're not going to amplify this, and we are pointing to it and saying, against all evidence, this is what someone is saying. Now that doesn't solve the problem. We know, because we're talking about a new world where there are new and emerging and now kind of dominant sources of information, people inside their own information bubbles. But I do think the traditional media do have, and journalists in general, have powerful new tools that were in many ways unthinkable even 20 years ago. Let's say in the run-up to Russia's full-scale invasion. There was some robust debate among media critics. I would hear it from Russian propagandists saying, well, the media is just falling in line with with the U.S. government and just stirring up a war scare, and this is all sort of Cold War 2.0. it reminds us of the run-up to war in 2003 when US journalists all fell in lockstep with the Bush administration and amplified the administration's case for war, unquestioningly. And there was a lot of self-flagellation in the media about that in the years that followed. The difference was news organizations can now order up satellite imagery, commercial satellite imagery, something that was only a capability that would have been available to a major state, a generation ago or 20 years ago. And that's a powerful tool so that we could actually check against what officials were saying and actually look at the imagery that said, yes, it actually looks like Russian formations are massing on the border. They have their war paint on, and this looks like a very real threat. The other thing that we have are what I would call the tools of verification. We talk a lot about open source intelligence as being an important new tool in journalism, and that everyone, potentially everyone in Ukraine with a smartphone, it is a nation of Bellingcats. I mean, people have been engaging in their own investigations based on all of this trove of digital information that's out there, from CCTV to images and video that people are taking on their smartphones, to look for perpetrators, to identify what's happening on the ground. And we are able to use...
1 minute, Nathan.
One of the important jobs I think that we have right now, if you are in the sort of, again, the quality control business, is verification. And that's an important way that we can help get information out of closed societies. Say, for instance, working in China, where, you can't have a correspondent everywhere. You may have correspondents who are going to be shadowed by, state security, but you hear news that there may be a protest at, say, the Foxconn factory. And videos are appearing on, on Weibo, WeChat, Chinese social media. They're very quickly scrubbed and taken down by censors. But before that happens, people are grabbing them. They're putting them on open platforms. We're able to translate them, geolocate them, and that's a very important tool. And we're able to basically say, this is happening reliably. So all of these tools for verification are very powerful. And they add to the larger mosaic of, the traditional reporter on the ground.
Thank you very much. Before we open the floor to questions, is there anyone who wants to immediately react to what the others have said in a very brief statement? Yes? No? Okay. So questions from the audience? Yes? I really need someone to... Oh, yeah, there is such... Yes, go ahead.
Добрий день, я Наталія Іщенко. Мені хотілося задати питання до представників іноземних медіа, взагалі до всіх.
Ask a question to the representative of foreign media, actually to all the panelists. Just imagine, I'm in Kyiv, and Kyiv has been shelled by dozens of missiles and check-in devices. So every night I hear the explosions, and the Russian experts are encouraged to have even more missile strikes, to kill Ukrainians, to destroy the decision-making centers. This very moment, these experts are interviewed by foreign media, including American media, for example, the reporters from Washington Post. So what do I need to think about at this moment? That the journalists from this foreign media are just stupid, they do not understand what's going on, that is number one. The second point, they are professionally incompetent, they do not understand who they are talking to. So this is just outrage, incompetence. And the third, my idea is that they were bribed by Putin. So which of these three answers is correct in your opinion?
No, thank you very much for the question. First of all, I would say that there is, and I would hope that it is a routine journalistic practice of looking at what it is that Russian propagandists are saying and understanding what their agenda is, and as well, without amplifying them, hopefully, talking about I think we have people who are doing very good media monitoring and singling out what I would call the most bloodthirsty examples of people who are appearing on Russian state television and basically calling for genocide. Now, whether that, you would disagree?
Ні, я не погоджуюсь, тому що саме у
I
цих експертів, про які я кажу, це
because the
Марков.
experts I'm
В нього
talking
брали
about is
коментар
Mr.
як
Markov,
незалежного
and he was
експерту. І він,
interviewed
до
as
речі,
an
на телебаченні
independent
мало каже. Він
expert.
веде
And
спеціальний
he's not
телеграм-канал,
present a lot
де
on
якраз
TV.
призиває
He has
вбивати
his own
українців.
Telegram
Можливо,
channel, and he is
іноземні
calling
медіа не
for
читають
killing
його
Ukrainians.
телеграм-канал, і тому не
Probably
розуміють,
foreign
що
media do not
Look, I
read
think
his Telegram channel and therefore do not
This is one
understand
of the
what's going
questions
on.
where a professional editor has to come in and ask their correspondents and the people who are writing, very serious questions about, do you know who this person is? Can you give, well, rather than presenting them as, this is a neutral and professional established political analyst and using kind of boilerplate term, rather than presenting this person as, someone who's a serious and dispassionate political analyst. To be frank, any voice that's coming sort of in the public sphere from Russia has to be treated, innately with any kind of skepticism, because it is a system of loyalty. That's to put it mildly.
Natalia, and then probably Peter.
No, I'm moving a bit to something else. I think that the big victory for Ukraine is the amount of the international media which is working, and the fact that they are open. And Ukraine is reported with one reason so well. Partially because it's important, but because it's very easy to get to Ukraine. There are very little restrictions. Honestly, for me to get to Syria, it won't be impossible. For Iran, I would need to pay money. To get a visa to Libya would be very hard. So 15 or 10,000 of the foreign reporters who came to Ukraine, it's really the result of the openness and the democracy of Ukrainian media landscape. And you should know that it won't be everybody whom you like. There would be a lot of people who won't get it. And if there would be 10,000 and out of them 500 would get it wrong, it's okay. We cannot also discuss whom we like, whom we not. There are security concerns, so the people who are coming in Ukraine and the media, which really can be an agent, and there were some of the scandals disclosed that, that reporter, in fact, worked for Russia, but that's up to the security service to check in before they give the credential. But my call is for Ukrainians, yes, debate, really debate, but I'm still appreciating and accepting all kind of voices and people coming, because the idea that we, discuss like these people we like, these people we don't like, with these people we agree, the strength of the democracy being able to argue your position, not with the bans, but with the arguments. So that's where I want really to bring back to what we are discussing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kreko.
Yeah, just a very brief comment. I'm not a journalist myself, but I just very frequently hear the position, even from journalists, that during an information war, you just can't rely on any sources. You're lost in the information. If you're not on the ground, then you just don't see what's happening. Even if you're on the ground, and it's something that people who went to the battlefront told me, you're just not, you can't see the big picture. And I think there is this, if a Western journalist writes about what's happening in Ukraine, in a lot of cases they feel this feeling insecurity that they are not sure if they are good or wrong, and usually it results in this tyranny of balance that let's give equal voice to one side and the other side, and unfortunately it still exists. So when writers, for example, were writing about the results of the so-called referenda without calling it so-called referenda and just putting one sentence at the end of the articles that the results are disputed and it's like not monitored by international election observers. You should not even report about that. And even if you mention in the article that these so-called elections were fraudulent on the secession of territories, it's like if the title, and these were the titles of the articles, that 99% of, let's say, people of Zaporozhye want to join Russia. So I think it results in outrageous practices. And yes, I think there is still a long way to go for a lot of parts of Western media to, to come up to this challenge.
Thank you. Peter, do you want to chip in and to answer? No? Yeah, good. All right. Any other questions? Yes, but I saw that the mic is with this lady. Yes, go ahead. And then Gulliver.
Botakoska Sembekova, University of Basel. So scholars at the University of Basel have been studying conspiracy theorists, and they've been saying that one of the reasons for wide success of those who also spread kind of pro-Kremlin propaganda is exactly what Peter Pomerantsev was saying, is that they are very skillful in providing their readership agency. So they don't simply teach and give you information, but they provide the information so that that the people who read them have the feeling of engagement. And so a lot of people come to these conspiracy theories not because they are interested in Russia, but simply because this is where they are provided. So I think the problem, and this is something that Nathan Hodge was talking about, or your conversation, is that I'm a historian, but during this war, one of the things that I've been noticing is that I think one can also go and provide, people the feeling of agency, but at the same time, I think one really needs to work on the self-reflection among, outlets like New York Times, the Washington Post. First of all, a lot of kind of Russian-born or just in scholarship journalists and scholars have more voice than
the
others.
Question is?
And the question is how to work on authority rather than going as conspiracy theorists and providing agency, but how do we introduce the culture of self-reflection, meeting the journalists, and so not that it's your own kind of...
Thank you, but because I think that the question is clear who wants to answer. And you please pass the mic to Gulliver in the first row. So...
I think that's a very beautiful idea. I'd like us to think about what that means, self-reflection and authority. The best actually paper on the power of conspiracy theories was actually that I've read, that I always use with my students, was written by Peter Kreko, where he talks about conspiracy theories giving people a sense of, and I'm sorry if I'm misquoting your excellent paper, a sense of community, motivated cognition, so explaining a complex world, and motivated cognition, community, and what was the third one? There was a third one.
Collective motivated cognition.
Collective, whatever. So it's, the conspiracy theories are providing all these things. And it reminds me about this one of my favorite lines in the study of propaganda by a French sort of sociologist called Jacques Ellul, who talked about propaganda being the remedy for loneliness. He talked about how when people feel unstable about who they are during times of social change, they will look for propaganda as creating a place of, he meant false community, pseudo-community. So in America, during the atomization of the COVID period, you have the growth of a movement like QAnon, a big conspiracy movement. So I'm not sure conspiracy theories give true agency. They give an ersatz community, an ersatz feeling of agency that is actually deeply manipulated by the people who are spreading it. And the response to that is, I think, what we've seen in Ukraine, actually always historically. You can reference the study that Nataliya and I did on 30 years of independence in Ukraine, which identified really one of the most important behavioral characteristics in Ukraine is this culture of horizontal connections and what Americans call civil society, which is genuine here and always has been historically. And what we've seen in Ukraine since the invasion is for me the true response to the sort of pseudo-community that propaganda like Russia's pushes, which is people working together in a true people's response to the war. Because what is remarkable about this war is, whatever you may think of the leadership, what it's done well, what it's done badly, is actually the bottom-up response. And that, for me, is the true response to the grounds on which this conspiratorial propaganda, this creation of a pseudo-community, this fake remedy for loneliness that conspiratorial and authoritarian propaganda provides. So I think if we want to really start investigating how we respond to the QAnons, the Russian propaganda, we really have to look at the dynamics in Ukraine. I think Ukraine is a model for everyone else.
Thank you very much. We are running out of time, but because we started 5 minutes later, we still have 6 minutes. So first from Goliath Kreko, then from Nataliya Gumeniuk. Please be concise in your questions.
Yeah, I had a question I wanted to ask, particularly to Peter Kreko, but to the others as well. Perhaps you'd like to answer. Yesterday, Poland passed a law that appears to be tailor-made to facilitate the prosecution of the leader of the opposition. It's the latest in 7 or 8 years of steps of what we might describe as democratic backsliding, heading perhaps in the direction of Hungary, in some cases actually explicitly following the Hungarian model. Meanwhile, Poland is, of course, the great ally of Ukraine, routinely embraced by the Ukrainian leadership, and I have the feeling that pressure on Poland about its democratic backsliding has eased as a result of the important role it's been playing in helping Ukraine fight off the Russian aggression. And my question is simply, how worried do you think we ought to be about this?
Thank you.
Should I respond?
Yes,
okay,
sure.
Okay, sorry.
It was specifically directed at
Okay,
you.
okay, thanks a lot. Brilliant question and an extremely important one. And this is something that we discussed briefly with Peter yesterday after arriving to the hotel extremely late. And Hungary and Poland is obviously convergent when it comes to democratic backsliding. And it's true that Orban is not just a pupil of other authoritarian leaders, including Vladimir Putin, but a teacher as well. And that's a very strong teacher in the region and a model for illiberal politicians. And yes, many of the laws that are passed in Poland, I think, are partially inspired by what happened in Budapest, but also the other way around. There was an anti-LGBT campaign last year before the election campaign that was inspired by Andrzej Duda's election campaign. So there is a mutual learning curve. And yes, I think it's a dangerous one. And it could be also dangerous because Poland, on the other hand, have, for good reasons, become a model of how to stand up against Russia. And I think what Poland does in terms of supporting Ukraine is historical. And it's important and it has to be meant. On the other hand, I see that there is a double standard emerging in the European Parliament, for example, that yes, and in the European politics, that Poland is the good guy, Hungary is the bad guy. When it comes to democratic backsliding, I think they are way more similar than that. And I think what is very important for Ukraine is that Poland should not be a role model when it comes to how to treat institutions. Because I think what happens in Poland to a large extent is a bit abusing the war situation to crack down on some parts of the opposition media and so on. So I think, yeah, your point is absolutely valid. I think we should be worried about that.
Thank you very much. I've been sent a clear message from the organizers that we should wind up, but we will hear the question from Nataliya Gumeniuk and probably not answer it, but leave it for further reflection.
Then I just make a remark. Thank you very much. The colleague from Kiev addressed a very important topic of the presence of the Russian pseudo-experts in the Western media. And in fact, some of those experts were nourished and legitimized by important Western institutions. Like, for example, Carnegie Russia was serving as a hub for, soft pro-Kremlin propaganda. Wilson Center is doing, well, a little bit of it right now, and there are a number of other cases. And my question was how to address this topic and how to raise awareness that not every expert who has this certificate of serious Western institution is actually an expert. Thank you very much.
Can I finalize with one thing? It's really, for me, the one answer to really make a strong distinguish. If there isn't any evidence that somebody is paid by somebody or is an agent, that is an agent, but don't bash everybody whom we disagree with of being an agent, and to make these distinctions very firm will work, because if we, just call agents everybody we disagree, then we lose. That would be my final thought with this panel.
Thank you very much. The paradox of the question that is in the title of this session is that it actually suggests a one-word answer. Does democracy have tools to defeat totalitarianism? Yes or no. However, we spent almost an hour discussing this because the underlying question is which tools has democracy to defeat totalitarianism? How easy or how difficult? Do we have to engage some totalitarian sectors or regimes to defeat totalitarianism and all this kind of stuff? I think that those people actually said more than the time that they took for answering the questions or making the statements. So give them a huge round of applause. And thank you for listening.
Зараз there is an announcement here. We will start in 5 minutes with 2 discussions. And they will be focused on reconstruction and challenges for the civil society and media. And they are interconnected with each other. So I recommend highly to attend both of them.